Welcome! Today here at the Ten Boom Institute we're going to do an author bio on the Bronte family. Now I've read two of the books by the Brontes, Jane Eyre, which I've blogged on before, and Wuthering Heights, which we need to blog on. And one interesting little fact about those books before I get into the life of the Brontes is that within 1 year, 3 sisters published 3 really famous novels. Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and Anne published Agnes Grey, all in the same, within a calendar year of each other in 1847. That's really fascinating. They were a very highly literary family, and of course they had their collection of poetry. So we'll begin at the beginning and talk about their father. His name was Patrick Bronte, and he came from a very poor background. And it was Bronte with an I, and he changed it to the more distinguished Bronte when he rose up in society. He was a very self-made man. He educated himself, and then he was given a scholarship or something. He became a clergyman and moved his way up there as well, and created a good middle-class lifestyle for his family. He and his wife married when he was older. He was in his 30s, and she came from a middle-class family. Her dad was like a shop owner or something like that, and they bought a home and moved to, he was the curate of Haworth, so he was kind of spiritually, that was his little area where he was kind of spiritually in charge, and he preached and that kind of thing. It was a small, bleak town on the Yorkshire moors, and Charlotte spent most of her life there. Now, this is specifically about Charlotte. But there were 6 children, 5 girls and a brother named Branwell. That was the mother's maiden name, and he was named for her. There were a lot of tragedies in the Bronte family, and I think as you read their writings, some of that sadness and longing comes through. Definitely in Wuthering Heights, which of course I didn't want to read, and then I did read, and the whole time I'm thinking, why am I reading this book? And then I went and had a fabulous discussion on it, and I wanted to read it again. They're very starkly different as well, the kinds of writings that the family produced. Of course, Emily and Charlotte are the most famous, and these are the 2 most famous works, although Agnes Grey also has a place. There was another book that Anne wrote, and it's also a famous novel. It's Windrow Hall, or I can't remember the whole name. So they are educated at home, and then the girls go off to a girls' boarding school. And actually Agnes Grey, well, it tells about when she was a governess. Jane Eyre especially captures many of the experiences that the girls had there. Certainly the feeling of what Jane goes through in her boarding school is definitely much of what Charlotte felt in the boarding school that they were in. And it was a horrible environment. And they came home. They died the same year, and Charlotte attributed their deaths to the ill management of the school. The girls got very ill, and they came home and they couldn't be cured, and so Maria and Elizabeth died after they spent time in that boarding school. When they were little, they had a rich fantasy life. They had an imaginary kingdom of Angria, and they would write stories about it. Not very many of those remain. I'd love to see if I'm going to do a search after this and see if I can find any of those existing stories and link them for you if I can, so that we can read some of those. That was a very sad time for the family when the girls died. The mother also died when they were very young, and the aunt came to live, and she ended up staying and helping to raise them. She was very much she was very strict, and she was very much about respect. The dad kind of tried to remarry, but it didn't ever really work out, so their aunt ended up helping to raise them. Then Charlotte was 8 when they went to this boarding school. They went there in 24, and then they came back. I'm not exactly sure how long that they were there, and then the 2 sisters died. When she was 15, she was 9. Oh, they were only there a year. Okay, so she was 5 when her mother died. She was 9 when her sisters died. And then she went off to, this is my timeline here, she went off at 15 to Miss Wooler's school, 1831 to 32. And then she went on at age 19 to become a teacher and served as a governess from ages 22 to 26. Now, all along, these girls, they're definitely readers, and they're definitely very creative individuals, and they also wrote things. This is an interesting thing. Okay, so at age 26, she goes to Brussels with Emily to study languages, and they're there for less than 2 years. Those years after they went to boarding school, when Charlotte was 8 and they came home and the girls died, 2 of the sisters died, the father could not bring himself to send them off to school again. So they spent a lot of years at home, and the aunt and their father educated them for those years between she was about 9 to about 15 when she went off to school again, and then became a teacher, then became a governess. The sisters didn't ever marry. I don't think any of them ever married. And her brother Branwell became a very heavy drinker, and he also died young. He died at age 32 after at another tragic moment, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Her siblings were her best friends, and they had spent their childhoods together. It was a small town. It wasn't like today's society where you run off and play with the neighbor's children all the time. They were each other's best friends, and so they were a very tight-knit group, and were very imaginative together. At one point that these 3 remaining sisters thought that they would open a school together, and they wrote up this ad and advertised, and no one ever responded to it, so they gave up the idea. They were all afflicted with nervousness, and I don't know if that's because they were isolated when they were young or there was something genetic going on. They had frequent depressions. Her brother was an alcoholic and died almost essentially from alcoholism. And so there were many tragedies. There was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of struggle. There was a lot of loneliness. There was a lot of happiness too, and a lot of creativity, and also success. At one point, and I don't know like the backstory behind it, but at one point Charlotte discovered Emily's poetry and she loved it. And I don't know if she had been writing some poetry of her own or she decided to write some poetry then, but they decided they were Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, I think were their pseudonyms, and they published a book of poetry, the 3 sisters together, and the reviews were good, but the sales were slow. Emily was really violated and upset by this discovery of her personal poetry because it was for her. It was very personal, and she didn't mean for anybody to read it. But then when she received all this encouragement and was told it's really, really good stuff, then they were able to get it published. And so after that success, they kind of gave them the confidence, and they all started writing novels, which I think is really fascinating, and all had success with their novels. And I think they were probably editors for each other. I'm sure there was some natural ability there. I know for a fact that there was a lot of reading that went on, and good reading makes for good writers, so I'm sure that contributed as well. So in the same year, 1847, like I said, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and Agnes Grey were all published. So fascinating. The book of poetry was published in a little bit before then. I didn't write down the years that the poetry was published. So after they're published, the next year is very tragic for the family. It's this devastating. They already lost their mom. Then they lost their 2 sisters within the same year in, let's see, in 1825. And in 1848, the year after their novels are published, within the same year, Branwell, the brother, dies, Emily dies, and Anne dies. I mean, and Emily dies. And so, and Anne dies. And Charlotte's the only one left. All her siblings have died before her, and her mother has died before her. And it's just her and her father and her aunt left. So I can't even imagine. She's in her late 30s, and she continues writing, publishes a couple other novels, and she actually starts dating a clergyman, and her father forbids her to marry him, and she finally gets up the courage and marries him anyway. Defies her father, which creates a rift between them, which is kind of eventually healed. But she doesn't live much longer either. She becomes pregnant and dies while she's pregnant at the age of, I think she's 39 or 40 when she dies. And many felt like her happiest time was those last couple of years of her life when she was married and when she was pregnant and expecting her own child, which is ironic because she'd had a lot of success in her literary career, but she'd had so much tragedy in her personal life watching each of her siblings pass before her. I can't even imagine. They were her best and closest friends, and to watch each other die in that way would be so tragic. So after she died, not too long afterward, Mrs. Gaskell wrote a biography, and there was a lot of mystery and scandal that surrounded the family for a long time. I think this book probably contributed to some of that, but I'll try to find her biography, and link that for you as well. If you're interested in learning more about the Brontes, you could read that original biography, and you could read maybe some of their stories and some of their poetry. But they're a fascinating family, and it's quite sad and tragic that the father was actually, I think it's Patrick, was older, quite a bit older than his wife, in his mid-30s, had all these children, and watched them all pass before he did, his wife and all his children. So tragic. But such an incredible literary tradition, legacy that they've left, especially the girls, through their poetry and their novels, that will never be forgotten. And some of the most read novels, Wuthering Heights is especially unique and celebrated for its use of language, which is actually absolutely brilliant and beautiful. But it is a tragic story, and you'll want to gear up for it. But that's for another day, another book review. Anyway, that's the Bronte family. Very worth reading about and reading their works and learning more about them. So I encourage you to do that, and always learn about the author before you read. It's always a fascinating journey to know the background of the author in the book. I always encourage everyone to do that to improve their experience in reading. So thanks for joining me today. Like us on Facebook if you like us, watch our other posts, and share this with a friend. We'll see you next time.